Hello and welcome to the Tudor Learning Circle premium course for August. This month's course is on Tudor Explorers, and this is Unit 2. In the first unit, we talked about the build-up to exploration leading to Henry VII and the Cabots in England. But of course, Henry VIII didn't seem as interested in exploring the newly discovered land of the Americas as his father did, and so exploration was put on the back burner for a bit. It wasn't until the mid-16th century that we saw the next major expedition launched by Edward VI to find the Northeast Passage. That trip ushered in a new era of Elizabethan exploration, leading to the golden age of exploration under some of the most famous names that we all learned in school, like Robisher, Drake, and Raleigh. So I just want to say this before I get started. These are not men that we would ever want to emulate. They were brutal, and the way they treated native people in the lands that they explored was tragic. It was cruel and it was criminal. But I've said before in other episodes in my podcast that I don't actually believe in holding people of the past to the same norms and standards of today. We are all hopefully evolving and growing over time and becoming better as a society. And things that make us sick today, like bear baiting, for example, is a good time on a Sunday afternoon, were normal and enjoyable for people in the Tudor and Elizabethan period. And let's be honest, in 500 years, if humans are still alive on this planet, I don't want to be judged based on the standards and norms that are perhaps commonly understood then, but we've never even considered. One example of this that I go back to often in my head is the dairy industry and factory farming, which is just so terrible on so many levels, and it's not related to Tudor history, but it is related to being judged by the past. I firmly believe that in 50 or 100 years, we will be judged very, very harshly on the way we, the collective we, treat the animals that provide us with food. But now it's considered normal for the vast majority of Western, European, and American civilization. Most people don't even register it or think about it. 10 years ago, before I visited the Gentle Barn Farm Animal Rescue in Santa Clarita, California, and learned about dairy farms, I never even thought about where milk came from. It was not on my radar at all. So that's my little monologue on the way history sees these people. They were flawed. In many ways, they acted in ways that make us sick to our stomachs. And yet, that doesn't take away from the fact that our lives are built on the actions that they took. It's up to us, alive now, to take their legacy, to understand it, and to turn it into something better, and to build something more perfect on it. Right? So that's my story about that. So with that said, let's discuss the mid to late 16th century quest to find a passage to India and begin with the Muscovy Company. By the later part of Henry VIII's reign, the beginnings of the Muscovy Company were put into place when Sebastian Cabot, John Cabot's son, who had been working with the Spanish, arrived back in England and began lobbying for an expedition to sail north in order to find a new route to Asia over Russia. Portugal and Spain were busy looking for the Northwest Passage. England got clever and decided they wanted to look for a Northeast Passage. One of the driving forces was Sebastian Cabot, the son of John. He was born in Bristol, but he worked for Spain much of his life. He became a pilot major and learned a lot about the way the Spanish and Portuguese were navigating and learning about their newly discovered lands on the other side of the Atlantic. Sebastian began to believe that the riches of the Pacific Ocean could be reached by going north and east, and he wanted a country to try it. So he was talking to Henry VIII's ambassador to Spain, as well as another Bristol merchant who lived in Seville, and they all began to hatch a plan to have England try out his theory of the Northeast Passage. But it would take years for such a voyage to happen, including letters written to Henry VIII, appealing to his ambition. And then, of course, Henry died in the middle of that, and Sebastian moved back to England. More letters were written, funding was secured, but Cabot and those who believed in him were talking it up and getting traction. Then they met a man called Richard Chancellor, who was embodied in all of the new learnings that Cabot was familiar with. He was a mathematician, he knew how to read maps, he understood astronomy, many other of these more modern skills. Cabot wanted him to be the captain of at least one of the boats when they finally secured the funding and permission. In 1551, a group of merchants formed the Company of Merchant Adventurers to New Lands. In full, the name was the Mystery and Company of Merchant Adventurers for the discovery of regions, dominions, islands, and places unknown. and they were specifically going to look for a northeast passage. A man called Hugh Willoughby, he had been a hero in wars against Scotland, was drafted to lead a group of 3 ships to the north. There were bad winds. They had to reach a point off of northern Norway where they had more winds and storms. They were stuck off coast in horrible winds. And one of the 3 ships, captained by Chancellor, was separated from the other 2. He kept going north towards the tip of Norway, hoping to meet Willoughby and the others there, but they never came. In later years, they would find that Willoughby apparently got stuck in pack ice, completely unprepared for the cold. And the next year, their ships with the frozen corpses of men inside were found by Russian fishermen, which is a grisly find. But Chancellor survived, and he managed to get past Norway and start to sail towards the northern coast of Russia, and he made it to the White Sea. The locals were amazed at these huge ships coming through the White Sea, and they helped him to get to one of the larger towns where a representative of the Tsar was able to meet with him. Ivan the Terrible heard about the ship, and he called Chancellor to Moscow to meet with him, and so they journeyed another 600 miles or so in the snow. Chancellor described Moscow as much larger than London, but built mostly out of wood and less sturdy. But the palace was luxurious, and the Tsar was willing to talk about trading with England. Russia was interested in this because they did not have a secure route to the Baltic Sea yet. There was wars with Poland going on and the other Baltic states, and so they were interested in having a route north to England as well. When Chancellor got back, of course, Edward VI had died, and he was now dealing with Queen Mary, but she was supportive of it as well. She was supportive of the relationship. And so Chancellor went back with this rechartered merchant adventurers company called the Muscovy Company. And then he came back carrying furs and cloth and other goods to trade, as well as diplomatic ambassadors. And the Muscovy Company became this diplomatic link between London and Moscow. Chancellor actually died in 1556, returning from Russia. He was shipwrecked off the coast of Scotland. But first, he saved the life of the first ambassador from Russia to England, who was on board with him. Now, this was a really pivotal journey for the English, not just because they had a new trading partner, new lands to discover, things like that, but because of this formation of the company. People could put in money to invest without having to take part in the trip. This was the first time that people in England could put disposable money into a venture like this and watch their returns coming back while not taking active part in the venture itself. The Muscovy Company had major early losses. They lost ships and cargo as well as men, but they persevered and were able to become an economic success and provide good returns for their investors. Later on, other companies would form this way, like the Levant Company for trade with Turkey, Syria, and Persia, as well as the much more famous and successful East India Company. It was in the trade of these joint stock companies, which were sanctioned by the crown, but happy to leave the work to private citizens, where the root of the British Empire formed. Also, many of the intellectual ideas that formed the English Empire were based on the idea that trade with native peoples and understanding of those people would create wealth. In the 1553 journey, Sebastian Cabot ordered the men to respect the people that they came across, to speak of God in general terms and not argue over theology, encouraging that matters of faith and ritual should not be discussed. Sailors should seem to bear with such laws and rights as the place has where ye shall arrive. In general, people of every region were to be treated with all gentleness and courtesy, and shown no point or sign of rigor and hostility. Though he did suggest that one way you could get people to give you information was to get them drunk first. Sensible, but something we would not encourage. Not only were these instructions more humane, one said, consider you that they are also men, but it made good business sense so that people would show an interest in trading with the English merchants. Again, these instructions were not adhered to, especially later on, a generation or so later, as people were dealing with the Americas. But for this first journey, it's interesting to note that there did seem to be a lot of emphasis put on having a good relationship with the native people. By the time Elizabeth took power, England was really suffering, had been sort of internally torn apart. There had been rebellions against Mary, then we had Edward, and there was just a mess. When Elizabeth took over, England was heavily dependent on wool trade with the Netherlands. 90% of English export business was semi-finished wool. Talk about putting your eggs in one basket, but even more so, the main customer was the Netherlands. So all the eggs in one basket, and then that basket only in one basket. The Netherlands were under Spanish control during this time. The Spanish did not like Elizabeth. So the economics of the wool trade was a huge concern during Elizabeth's reign, and they needed to find new markets. The problem was that by now Portugal and Spain pretty much had a monopoly on the Americas, and they were not going to give it away nicely. They kept their maps and their charts completely secret, and at such a high level that they were treated as important as any other security documents. Like I said in the previous unit, even though England was a seafaring country, people only sailed within sight of land. Most fishermen never lost sight of land in their entire lives. They were going to have to catch up quickly. And like I said in the last episode, there were some new technological advancements like the astrolabe and the compass, and they were soon able to measure a rough latitude. Longitude wouldn't come along for some time, but they could estimate the speed in a ship's log, and they could make a rough guess at their longitude. But England still needed something else, something like the charts and the maps that the Spanish and Portuguese had. They got it in the form of a textbook, Breve Compendio de la Sphere, a Spanish textbook by Martín Cortés. Someone involved with the Muscovy Company was able to get a hold of this book and translated it to The Art of Navigation and published it in 1561. Scholars agree that this book represents one of the decisive steps that led to the oceanic expansion of England. So, by the mid-1560s, England has a stable monarch, a new technology, and secret knowledge. They still need a burning impetus to take the risks that such voyages would require, both with money and potential loss of life. But relations with Spain provided one of these. England and Spain were still in this Cold War since Spain, ruled by a Catholic, did not recognize Elizabeth as queen. The idea that the New World was going to be settled completely by Catholics who were going to teach Catholic Christianity to all of the natives was something that Protestants could not stomach. One of these Protestants was called Richard Hacklight. I talked about him last time. He was a minister. He was also England's first travel writer. He began collecting every piece of information on travel and discovery that he could find. He went to France with Francis Walsingham to find out intelligence of what the French and the Spanish were doing exploration-wise, and he was commissioned by men like Walter Raleigh to write supporting treatises on why England should take risks involved and make the voyages of discovery. He spent his life trying to get voyages funded, essentially a one-man PR team for American colonization. Another person involved in the whole campaign was John Dee. He was a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and philosopher who advised Queen Elizabeth in her imperial policies. He stood between the two worlds of magic, i.e. astrology, and real hard science, just as they were beginning to become distinguishable. He was both a brilliant mathematician, an expert in geometry, and he practiced alchemy and occult philosophy. He had been a consultant with the Muscovy Company, preparing charts and instructing the crew on geometry and cosmography before they left for voyages to North America in 1576. So he had written a report commissioned by Robert Dudley and Christopher Hatton in 1570 called Britannicae Republicae Synopsis, Summary on the Commonwealth of Britain. And he summarized all the different issues facing the country and the possible outcomes of various actions. He proposed the rise of a British Empire using historical precedents in which he asserted England's prior claims to the New World. He believed that England should invest heavily in the Navy, have maritime supremacy, and then England could become wealthier through using resources found in the Americas and other newly discovered places. By 1588, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, England was on the up and up, had proved her maritime supremacy, which would be largely unchallenged until the 20th century. Many of the voyages of discovery occurred in partnership with privateering raids. In 1562, Elizabeth sent privateers to seize booty from the Spanish and Portuguese ships off the coast of West Africa. When the war with Spain intensified after 1585, Elizabeth approved further raids against Spanish ports in the Americas and against shipping returning home with treasure. Francis Drake famously raided the port of Cadiz the year before the Armada was defeated. One of the first explorers to catch public interest was Martin Frobisher. He led 3 expeditions in search of the Northwest Passage, and he was convinced that the Northwest Passage existed, this legendary route that would go through the Americas and lead to Asia. In 1576, he landed in Frobisher Bay on Baffin Island. He returned in 1577, claiming it in Elizabeth's name. And then in a third voyage, he tried but failed to set up a settlement in Frobisher Bay. After his first voyage, he gave a black rock to the company director, Michael Locke. He said it was the first rock that he'd picked up in the New World. Locke brought samples of the stone to the Royal Assayer in the Tower of London, and to 2 other expert assayers, all of whom declared that it was worthless and that there was nothing valuable in it at all. He then took this quote-unquote ore to an Italian alchemist living in London who claimed it was gold, or that it had gold in it. He showed Locke small amounts of the gold dust, and when he was asked why the other people investigating failed to find any of the gold, he said, "One must know how to flatter nature." Very cryptic comment. Michael Locke then secretly wrote to the Queen to tell her about the gold, and then he used this to get finance for another voyage. The stone then became the focus of a lot of interest from the company investors. They saw all kinds of wonderful profits, dollar signs, pound signs, gold dust in their eyes by mining in the New World. On his second voyage, Frobisher found what he thought was gold ore. He carried 200 tons of it home on 3 ships. And initially, it was valued to be worth £5.20 per ton. He was very encouraged. He returned to Canada with an even larger fleet, dug all kinds of mines around Frobisher Bay, carried 1,350 tons of ore back to England. Then they spent years smelting it, and they realized that the gold was worthless, fool's gold. So that would have been a major bummer. Some attempt was made at founding a settlement, like I said, on the third voyage, but there was dissension and discontent, and a colony was unable to be founded. On the last day of August that year, the fleet set out on its return, and they reached England in the beginning of October. Also then, the Cathay Company, which had been backing these trips, went bankrupt, and Michael Locke, the director, was ruined. He was sent to debtor's prison several times. From 1577 to 1580, Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, the first English person to do so. In the Golden Hind, the most famous ship, he had an epic expedition of discovery and adventure. Drake had previously made a number of voyages to the Caribbean on trading missions, and he had carefully learned and recorded how to navigate around the West Indies on these previous trips. In 1577, he set sail from Plymouth with 3 ships, the Golden Hind being the largest at 120 tons. He sailed between all 5 continents, Europe, Africa, North and South America, and Asia. The trip took 1,020 days, and he returned with only 56 men 3 years after setting sail. The objective of the voyage was to intercept gold and jewels, which the Spanish were removing from South America, and then shipping back to Spain across the Isthmus of Panama. Drake was incredibly successful at this. He captured 26 tons of silver, half a ton of gold, thousands of coins, jewelry and jewels, mainly from Peru and Bolivia. He got riches beyond anybody's dreams. So he intercepted his treasure off the coast of Peru, but he couldn't set sail back along South America because the Spanish ships were awaiting his return. So he proceeded north up to California, onwards to Vancouver, 1,000 miles up to Alaska in an effort to return via the rumored Northwest Passage. Supposedly, Elizabeth I herself asked him to return and find this Northwest Passage. So he failed to find it, so he was left with no option but to sail west towards Japan. This route took the Golden Hind across the Pacific Ocean, past the north coast of Australia onto Indonesia, the Spice Islands, where he got 6 tons of clothes, themselves worth their weight in gold during that time. And then he went southwest past India, Madagascar, around the Cape of Good Hope. They were long given up for dead, and the Plymouth residents were amazed to see Drake and his small ship return in September of 1580. Once he had been reassured that Queen Elizabeth was still alive, he landed the Golden Hind full of treasure and jewels and became one of the most famous men in the world. The total value on board was 160,000 Elizabethan pounds, or almost £500 million in today's money. The share that went to Queen Elizabeth alone was worth more than the annual national debt, and Drake was knighted on board. He eventually became nicknamed El Draco, or the Dragon, by the Spanish. Then in 1583, Humphrey Gilbert sailed to Newfoundland, and he took possession of the harbor of St. John's together with all of the land within 200 leagues north and south of it. But his trip ran into tragedy on the way back. They didn't make any kind of attempt to leave a settlement or anything like that because they didn't have supplies. Gilbert insisted on sailing in his favorite, the HMS Squirrel. He then ordered a controversial change of course, and one of the ships in the fleet, the Delight, ran aground and soon sank with the loss of all but 16 of its crews on one of the sandbars of Sable Island. And so this set the tone of the voyage back. Later on, a sea monster was sighted, said to have resembled a lion with glaring eyes. Gilbert was sailing with the Golden Hind. The Golden Hind was recruited for this trip as well. He was on the Squirrel, but he stepped on a nail, and he went aboard the Golden Hind to have his foot bandaged. And he also wanted to talk to the captain of the Golden Hind about how to keep their ships together during the Atlantic crossing. On the way back near the Azores, the two ships encountered high waves and heavy seas, supposedly as high as a pyramid. The Squirrel was nearly overwhelmed, but did recover. And apparently, a lot of people on the Golden Hind suggested that the crew leave the Squirrel and go to the Golden Hind, which was larger. But he didn't want to. He was obstinate. He loved his ship. He stayed put. He was apparently observed sitting in the stern, reading a book. The Golden Hind came within hailing distance, and the crew on the Golden Hind heard Gilbert cry out, "We are as near to heaven by sea as by land." And he lifted his palm to the skies to illustrate his point. At midnight, the lights were extinguished, and the watch on the Golden Hind cried out the general was cast away, and the Squirrel had gone down with everybody on board. Then in 1584, the Queen granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter for the colonization of Virginia, named, of course, after the Virgin Queen. Raleigh and Elizabeth were looking towards having a base from which to raid Spanish boats. So 20 years before Jamestown, Elizabethan England had this equivalent of the Apollo program. They poured money and resources into stopping the Spanish expansion in the New World. England's early outpost was Roanoke, the island near Virginia, where over 100 men, women, and children would land in 1587. This was different than later expeditions to Jamestown because there were families on board. The governor's daughter, who was heavily pregnant, was among the colonists. She gave birth to the first English person born in the New World, Virginia Dare. But the governor left to go back and get more supplies, then got caught up in war with Spain and the Spanish Armada, and it became difficult for him to come back. When he finally did make it back to America 3 years later, he found an abandoned settlement with signs that maybe the colonists had gone to Croatan, an island about 50 miles to the south. There was no signs of distress or emergency, just the signs for Croatan. He didn't have enough provisions to keep going south, and he had to head back to England, not knowing what had happened to his family and his friends. When he tried to persuade his patron, Walter Raleigh, to make another trip back, Raleigh had already been distracted by a new shiny object, tales of the city of gold, El Dorado in South America. And he put all of his resources into a trip there, which was a complete failure. And the fate of the Roanoke colonists remain a mystery. In 1600, the Queen would charter the famous East India Company, which established trading posts. And in later centuries, this evolved into British India on the coasts of what is now India and Bangladesh. And of course, after Elizabeth died, this all didn't stop. England continued the colonization efforts that had begun, and explorers like Henry Hudson continued to look for the Northwest Passage. As religious tensions escalated, the separatists and the Puritans look towards the New World as their base to escape persecution in England. And that would take us to Jamestown and the early successful settlements and their legacy, which we will talk about next time. So thank you again for being part of the Tudor Learning Circle Premium membership, and I look forward to hearing any thoughts you have. I'll see you in the group, and I will talk to you again in the third installment.